The picked feed flickers with static, and through the distortion you see them, sisters of battle, their crimson armor slick with blood and mud, standing shoulder to shoulder with figures that should not exist in their formation. The recording cuts out. When it resumes, a canoness removes her helm, and her eyes hold something worse than hatred. They hold understanding. They hold acceptance of a partnership that should have ended with bolter fire and righteous fury. Yet here they stand, united against something far worse than each other. This is not propaganda. This is not imperial myth-making. This is the confession of those who survived when faith alone was not enough. The Adepta Sororitas exist as the Emperor's daughters in all but blood. Warriors who channel their devotion into acts of violence so pure that even the Adeptus Astartes regard them with measured respect. They are the militant arm of the Ecclesiarchy, the ones who burn the heretic, purge the mutant, and destroy the witch, without hesitation or mercy. Their faith is their armor, their conviction their weapon, and their certainty their shield against doubt. Every sister who takes the vow knows that compromise is the first step toward damnation, that to question is to falter, and to falter is to fail the God Emperor who watches from his golden throne. They do not negotiate with xenos, they do not parley with heretics, they do not acknowledge that any path exists except absolute obedience to the imperial creed. This is doctrine, this is law. This is the foundation upon which their entire existence rests. Yet in the eastern reaches of the Segmentum Obscurus, on a world whose name has been stricken from official records and replaced with a designation so coded that even inquisitorial files reference it only as Manifest Null 77, something happened that should have been impossible. A situation arose that forced the hand of Canoness Heleth Argentius, commander of the Order of the Ebon Chalice's third preceptory, to make a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her days. The world itself mattered little in strategic terms. A minor forged shrine dedicated to the production of ecclesiarchal incense burners and devotional autoflagellation devices. Inhabited by perhaps 3 million souls, whose entire purpose revolved around manufacturing the implements of faith. The planet's tithe was spiritual rather than material, its value measured in the prayers whispered by billions across the sector as they breathed in the sacred smoke or felt the blessed lash against their flesh. Then the warp storms came. Not the navigable disturbances that occasionally disrupt trade routes and require ships to wait weeks or months for passage, but the kind of reality-shredding tempests that suggest something on the other side is trying very hard to push through. The Astronomican's light guttered and died in that region of space, leaving hundreds of systems isolated in the dark. Astropathic communication became impossible. Relief fleets turned back or vanished entirely. Manifest Null 7 found itself alone, and in that isolation, something noticed its existence. The first attacks came from the underhives, from the forgotten manufactorums where the machine spirits had grown old and bitter. Workers disappeared during shift changes. Entire assembly lines fell silent. When the Adeptus Arbites descended to investigate, they found the missing workers had not fled or been killed. They had been incorporated into structures that defied physics and sanity in equal measure, their bodies woven into impossible architectures that hummed with a frequency that made observers' teeth crack and bleed. The planetary governor, a man whose family had held the position for 6 generations and who knew his duty to the emperor better than he knew his own children's names, declared a state of emergency and activated the ancient beacon that would summon the Adepta Sororitas. The Order of the Ebon Chalice maintained a watchful presence in the sector, their fortress monastery on the neighboring world of Sanctus Prime housing enough firepower to scour a dozen worlds clean of life. Canoness Heleth responded personally, bringing with her 3 full centuries of battle sisters, along with support elements including Seraphim, Retributors, and a precious exorcist tank whose pipe organ missile batteries could level city blocks with liturgical precision. They made planetfall expecting heretics, cultists, perhaps even a minor demonic incursion that Faith and Prometheum could handle in a matter of weeks. What they found waiting in the depths beneath the forge shrines was neither heretic nor daemon. The enemy had no flesh to burn, no soul to damn, no faith to corrupt or break. They were machines, but not the sanctified mechanisms of the Adeptus Mechanicus, or even the corrupted constructs of the Dark Mechanicum. These were older, so much older that the Mechanicus datalooms had no classification for them, no ritual of understanding, no litany of disassembly. They moved with a precision that mocked organic life, their weapons firing beams of light that unraveled matter at the molecular level. And when a battle sister fell to their fire, she did not bleed or scream. She simply ceased to exist, her atoms scattered across dimensions that had no names in Imperial Gothic. The Necrons had awakened, and they had decided that this world belonged to them. Heleth fought as her faith demanded. She led from the front, her blessed bolter singing its hymn of destruction, her power sword crackling with the Emperor's wrath. Her sisters followed without question, dying in droves as the soulless machines advanced through corridors too narrow for proper defensive positions, emerging from walls that should have been solid stone, phasing through cover that should have protected the faithful. For 3 days and nights, they held the main cathedral district, piling the shattered, metal corpses of Necron warriors high enough to build barricades, only to watch in horror as those same warriors began reassembling themselves from component parts, their self-repair protocols mocking the very concept of death. Flamers that should have melted adamantium barely scorched their living metal bodies. Melter weapons that could punch through battle tank armor left them damaged but functional. Even the Exorcist's blessed missiles, each one inscribed with 17 different prayers of banishment, only succeeded in destroying the Necrons temporarily before their resurrection protocols activated and brought them back online. On the 4th day, as the perimeter contracted to a circle barely 200 meters across and ammunition reserves dropped below 20%, Canoness Heleth received a Vox transmission that she almost deleted unheard. The frequency was wrong, using Imperial military encryption that was 15 years out of date, and the accent that spoke High Gothic through the static was inflected with sounds no human throat should produce. The message was simple enough that even through her fury and desperation, she understood its meaning. There were others fighting the Necrons, others who had been fighting them for longer than humanity had existed. Others who understood these machines in ways the Imperium never could, because they had watched civilizations rise and fall in the time it took the Necrons to complete one hibernation cycle. The Aeldari had been monitoring the tomb world's awakening for months, and they wanted to help. The first response that came to Heleth's mind was the correct one, the doctrinal one, the response that her training and faith demanded. She reached for the Vox controls to send a rejection that would make her position clear. The Adepta Sororitas did not ally with xenos, did not compromise with the alien, did not acknowledge that any purpose could be served by cooperation with those who existed outside the Emperors and light. Her finger hovered over the transmission key as another wave of Necron warriors phased through the cathedral floor, and she watched Sister Bethania, who had served beside her for 20 years, and whose voice led the evening prayers with such purity that even the most jaded veterans wept, simply vanish as a Gauss flare beam reduced her to her component atoms. In that moment, watching her sister's armor clatter empty to the ground with nothing but ash inside, Heleth made a choice that would either save her soul or damn it forever. She accepted the transmission. She spoke words in broken Aeldari that she had learned from interrogating prisoners before their executions, and she arranged a meeting. The craft-world Aeldari who appeared at the designated coordinates wore armor that seemed to be woven from hardened light and contempt, their movements flowing with a grace that made even the most skilled battle sisters look clumsy by comparison. Their leader, an autarch whose name, translated roughly as sorrowful victory in the face of inevitable defeat, regarded Heleth with eyes that had watched Terra's sun before humanity learned to make fire. The conversation that followed was not diplomatic. It was not friendly. It was two apex predators recognizing that a third, even more dangerous predator was loose in their territory, and that pride was a luxury neither could afford. The autarch explained the situation with the kind of brutal honesty that only comes from genuine desperation. The tomb world beneath their feet was not a small outpost. It was a Necron crown world, home to a dynasty that once ruled a galactic sector during the war in heaven, and its pharaoh was waking with ambitions that would see both the Imperium and the craft worlds reduced to component atoms suitable for conversion into more Necron infrastructure. Heleth listened because she had no choice. The autarch offered intelligence, the locations of the tomb complexes, the weak points in Necron, patrol routes, the specific frequency disruptions that could temporarily disable their resurrection protocols. In exchange, the Aeldari wanted human bodies on the front lines, expendable troops who could absorb the initial Necron response, while the craft world's more valuable aspect warriors positioned themselves for surgical strikes. The word expendable hung in the air between them, and Heleth felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognizing truth. The Adepta Sororitas were expendable. They always had been. The difference was that the Ecclesiarchy dressed that expendability in the language of sacrifice and martyrdom, while the Aeldari simply acknowledged it as tactical reality. She agreed to the alliance with conditions that made the autarch's lip curl in what might have been respect or disgust. No Aeldari would enter the Cathedral of the Undying Flame, which still served as the sisters' headquarters and spiritual center. No xenos technology would be used by human hands. No battle sister would take orders directly from an Aeldari commander. They would coordinate, not integrate. They would cooperate for the duration of the Necron threat, and when the last metal monster was reduced to slag, they would resume their natural state of hostility. The autarch agreed because the alternative was fighting the Necrons alone, while human soldiers died uselessly in uncoordinated attacks that accomplished nothing except feeding the resurrection forges. They sealed the pact not with oaths or contracts, but with a simple nod of acknowledgement between warriors who understood that survival sometimes required compromises that faith alone could not permit. The first joint operation began at dawn on the 5th day. Heleth deployed her Seraphim squad, the jump pack-equipped sisters who could strike from above with bolt pistols and flamers, to draw out Necron response forces from the primary tomb entrance. The Aeldari, rangers, long-range specialists who could kill with impossible precision from kilometers away, positioned themselves on the surrounding ridgelines with instructions to target any Necron lord or overseer unit that emerged to coordinate the response. The plan was simple: provoke, thin, and assault. Make the Necrons come to them, strip away their command structure before it could properly deploy, then hit the tomb entrance with everything they had while the enemy was disorganized. The sisters descended like avenging angels, their prayers broadcast through external vox grills as they strafed the tomb entrance with blessed ammunition. The Necrons responded exactly as the autarch predicted, pouring out of the entrance in organized formations led by a towering Necron lord, whose staff crackled with energy that made the air taste like ozone and burned copper. The Rangers fired, not with las weapons or stubbers, but with rifles that launched monomolecular shuriken at hypersonic velocities, and the Necron Lord's head exploded in a shower of sparks and liquid metal before it had taken 3 steps into the sunlight. The coordination units that followed died the same way, their resurrection protocols unable to keep pace with the surgical precision of Aeldari marksmanship. The warrior-level Necrons continued their advance, but without proper oversight, their formation coherence deteriorated into something that tactical doctrine could exploit. Heleth led the main assault personally, her command squad advancing behind a wall of storm shields, while Retributor squads laid down, suppressing fire with heavy bolters that chewed through Necron warriors with blessed rounds. The Aeldari Dire Avengers, aspect warriors specialized in laying down storms of shuriken fire, swept in from the flanks to catch the Necrons in a devastating crossfire. The sound of battle was a cacophony that drowned out thought. Bolters barking their monotonous rhythm, shuriken weapons shrieking as they flung their deadly cargo, Necron Gauss weapons hissing as they flayed reality itself, and above it all, the hymns of the Adepta Sororitas, singing praises to the Emperor as they killed and died. A sister to Heleth's left went down, her armor breached by a Gauss flare. She did not scream. She continued singing until her lungs dissolved, and the sister behind her took up the next verse without missing a note. The fighting inside the tomb was worse. The Necrons had home advantage here, their weapons able to fire through walls that their bodies could phase through at will, while the Imperial and Aeldari forces had to advance through choke points and corridors designed by minds that thought in geometric principles, alien to biological comprehension. The Aeldari warlocks, psychers who wielded the warp with a control that made even the most disciplined Imperial-sanctioned psychers look like children playing with matches, led the way through the tombs using their farsight to predict Necron ambushes before they could materialize. Heleth watched them work with a mixture of professional admiration and visceral revulsion. They were using the warp, channeling the energies of chaos itself, yet they did so with a precision that suggested complete mastery rather than the desperate gambles of Imperial psychers who always stood one moment away from catastrophic possession. The alliance worked because it had to work, because the alternative was extinction. The Seraphim learned to coordinate their attacks with Aeldari swooping hawks. The jump pack equipped aspect warriors whose weapons could deliver devastating hit-and-run strikes. The Retributors learned to hold their fire when Aeldari fire dragons, anti-armor specialists armed with fusion guns, moved into position to deliver killing blows against Necron-heavy constructs. The Aeldari learned that when a battle sister said she would hold a position, she meant it literally. She would hold that position until every enemy was dead or until she reprose, died trying, with no consideration given to tactical withdrawal or strategic retreat. They learned that faith was not a weakness to be exploited, but a weapon as devastating as any in the Imperium's arsenal, because a soldier who believes her death serves a higher purpose fights with an intensity that transcends tactical rationality. Casualties mounted on both sides. The Necrons, seemingly infinite in number as their resurrection protocols continued to bring fallen warriors back online, ground forward with the inevitability of a geological process. An Aeldari Guardian Defender died saving a sister from a Necron Lord's staff strike, his body reduced to ash but buying enough time for the sister to drive her chainsword through the Lord's central processing core. A battle sister threw herself on a wounded Aeldari ranger, her armor absorbing Gauss fire that would have annihilated the lighter xenos, and died with her body shielding someone whose existence her faith said was an abomination. These were not acts of friendship. They were not expressions of unity or brotherhood. They were simple calculations made by soldiers who recognized that dead allies could not contribute to victory, regardless of what doctrine said about those allies' right to exist. On the seventh day they reached the central chamber where the Pharaon slept. The tomb complex opened into a vault so vast that the far walls disappeared into darkness, and in the center, on a throne that seemed to be carved from solidified starlight and malice, sat a Necron so ancient that its metal body showed the corrosion of millions of years. The Pharaon was not sleeping. It was waiting, its glowing eyes watching the approach of the combined Imperial Aeldari force with something that looked disturbingly like amusement. When it spoke, its voice came not from any physical vocalization but directly into their minds, bypassing language entirely to communicate concepts so vast and alien that several sisters began bleeding from their ears. The Pharaon explained that it had allowed them to reach this point, that it had observed their cooperation with interest, calculating how best to turn their newfound coordination against them. The Necrons had fought both humans and Aeldari before, countless times across eons, and they understood individual species' tactical preferences with the kind of intimacy that only comes from watching prey struggle against inevitability. But this cooperation was new, novel enough to warrant study before it was crushed. The Pharaon had learned what it needed to learn. Now it would demonstrate why such cooperation was ultimately meaningless against an intelligence that had optimized warfare before these species' ancestors had crawled from whatever primordial pools spawned them. The Pharaon rose from its throne, and the tomb itself responded to its awakening. Scarabs poured from hidden compartments in the walls, clouds of them so dense they looked like liquid mercury flowing uphill. Immortals, the elite Necron warriors whose weapons could punch through tank armor, phased into reality around the chamber's perimeter. A monolith, the hovering fortress tanks that served as Necron heavy support, materialized directly above the Aeldari position and began pouring particle whip fire down on them with geometric precision. The coordinated assault that had brought them this far shattered instantly against the kind of overwhelming force that tactics could not overcome. Sisters died. Aeldari died. The carefully constructed alliance threatened to collapse into chaos as units broke formation, sought cover, fired wildly at targets that phased out of existence before rounds could impact. Canoness Heleth felt the battle slipping away. She felt victory, already so tenuous, evaporating like water on a hot stone. She saw her sisters dying for an alliance that her faith said was damnation itself, saw the Aeldari trying to mount an organized retreat that their pride would not allow them to call a rout, and she made a choice that went beyond doctrine or training. She activated her Vox and ordered her sisters to form a defensive perimeter around the Aeldari psykers. The warlocks needed time to channel their powers, time to combine their individual abilities into something that could threaten a being as powerful as a Necron Pharaon, and they would not get that time unless someone was willing to die buying it for them. The Order of the Ebon Chalice formed a circle, their storm shields overlapping, their flamers and bolters firing outward in all directions as the Necron assault intensified. Heleth stood at the center with the warlocks, her sword in one hand and her rosarius in the other, the conversion field generator glowing with stored energy as it absorbed and redirected incoming fire. She recited the litany of protection, her voice cutting through the chaos, and her sisters responded with the traditional call and response that they had practiced 10,000 times in the training halls of Sanctus Prime. The Aeldari warlocks began their working, and Heleth felt the air grow thick with warp energy that made her teeth ache and her scalp crawl. She had been taught to hate psykers, to view them as necessary evils at best and corrupting influences at worst. Now she stood as their guardian, protecting them with her life as they wove destruction from the raw stuff of the Imperium. The psychic assault, when it came, was not subtle. The warlocks did not try to penetrate the Pharaon's mental defenses or corrupt its programming. They did something simpler and infinitely more devastating. They reached into the warp and pulled, creating a localized rift that flooded the chamber with energies that the Necron's ancient technology could not easily process. Daemons did not emerge. The warlocks maintained too tight a control for that. But the raw warp energy disrupted the quantum matrices that allowed Necron technology to function, created interference patterns that scrambled resurrection protocols and phase shift capabilities. The Pharaon staggered, its perfect coordination faltering for the first time in millions of years, and in that moment of vulnerability, the combined Imperial Aeldari force struck. Heleth led the charge with the Autarch beside her, two warriors from civilizations that had no common ground except their refusal to surrender. Her power sword found the Pharaon's chest while the Autarch's fusion pistol burned through its cranial unit. Around them, Sisters and Aeldari fought with the kind of desperate synchronization that emerges when survival depends on absolute trust between soldiers who have no reason to trust each other except that they have already bled together. The Pharaon's body collapsed, its self-repair systems overwhelmed by the combination of psychic disruption and focused violence, and the tomb itself began to shudder as the controlling intelligence that maintained its systems went offline. The retreat was not glorious. They ran through collapsing corridors as the entire complex began to destabilize, the Pharaon's death triggering some ancient failsafe that would rather bury the tomb forever than allow its secrets to be plundered. Sisters carried wounded Aeldari. Aeldari grabbed fallen sisters and dragged them toward the exits. The distinctions of species and doctrine became meaningless in the face of simple survival instinct. They emerged from the tomb 3 hours before the entire complex collapsed in on itself, taking with it several thousand dormant Necrons who would not wake to threaten this world or any other. The silence after battle was worse than the fighting. The survivors stood in the ash-covered wasteland that surrounded the tomb entrance, human and xenos alike covered in wounds and grime, and nobody knew what to say. Protocol dictated that Heleth should order the immediate execution of the Aeldari. Her oaths to the Emperor demanded it. The ecclesiarchal doctrine she had memorized as a child specified the exact prayers to recite while burning xenos alive. But her sisters were alive. The world was saved. The Necron threat, at least on this planet, was ended. She had accomplished her mission, which was to protect Imperial citizens and maintain the Emperor's realm. The methods she had employed were unorthodox, yes, heretical, possibly, but effective. The Autarch seemed to understand her internal struggle without words being spoken. The Aeldari gathered their dead, carefully collecting the soul stones that preserved their spirits from the predations of She Who Thirsts, and prepared to depart. Before leaving, the Autarch approached Heleth one final time. They did not salute. They did not shake hands or exchange tokens of alliance. The Autarch simply looked at her with eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall, and said in perfect High Gothic, "Your faith is a weapon. Do not let it become a chain." Then the Aeldari were gone, their grav tanks and transports lifting off with the kind of grace that made Imperial vehicles look clumsy by comparison. And Heleth was left standing with her sisters, knowing that everything had changed. The Ecclesiarchy's response was predictable. They dispatched an investigative team within 3 weeks of the warp storms clearing enough for astropathic communication to resume. Cardinals and their retinues arrived with data slates full of accusations and doctrinal references, demanding to know why Canoness Heleth had not chosen martyrdom over cooperation with the alien. She stood before them in her battered armor, still bearing the scorch marks from Necron Gauss weapons, and recited every action she had taken with clinical precision. She did not apologize. She did not claim ignorance of the law. She simply explained that she had been presented with 2 choices: watch her sisters die uselessly against an enemy they could not defeat alone, or accept help from a source that doctrine condemned but circumstance demanded. She had chosen survival. She had chosen to fulfill her oath to protect the Emperor's subjects. If that was heresy, then let the Ecclesiarchy explain to those 3 million saved souls why their canoness should have let them die for the sake of maintaining doctrinal purity. The cardinals convened for 6 days. They reviewed testimonies from every surviving battle sister, analyzed tactical recordings, consulted with inquisitors who specialized in xenos threats, and finally reached a conclusion that satisfied nobody. Canoness Heleth had acted within the boundaries of emergency discretion granted to senior officers facing extinction-level events, but her actions represented a dangerous precedent that could not be officially sanctioned. She was quietly reassigned to a frontier mission at the edge of Imperial space, where communication was sporadic and oversight minimal, effectively exiled without the formal condemnation that would have made her a martyr to those who believed pragmatism had its place, even in the Imperium's rigid doctrine. The sisters who served with her on Manifest Null 7/7 never spoke of the Alliance again, at least not in any official capacity. But in the quiet hours, when the fortress monastery settled into the rhythmic prayers of evening devotions, some would remember the Aeldari ranger who died shielding one of their own. They would remember fighting beside warriors whose existence their faith condemned, and finding in that cooperation a strange sort of kinship that transcended doctrine. They had learned something that the Ecclesiarchy could never officially acknowledge, that in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, survival sometimes demands alliances that faith cannot condone, but necessity cannot deny. The long-term implications rippled outward in ways that the Imperium's bureaucracy struggled to contain. Other orders' militant heard whispered accounts of the Ebon Chalice's cooperation with xenos forces. Some condemned it as heresy waiting to metastasize. Others quietly filed the information away, understanding that desperate times might require desperate measures. Inquisitors of the Ordo Xenos began drafting contingency protocols for what they called temporary tactical accommodations with non-chaos xenos forces in extinction scenarios. The language was carefully crafted to avoid using words like alliance or cooperation, but the meaning was clear enough. The Imperium was beginning to acknowledge, at least in its most secret councils, that humanity's position in the galaxy was not as secure as propaganda suggested. The moral implications haunted Heleth more than any official censure. She had saved lives, yes. She had protected Imperial citizens and preserved a world for the Emperor. But she had done so by compromising the very principles that made the Adepta Sororitas what they were. Every night, she knelt before the shrine in her private quarters and prayed for guidance, for confirmation that her choice had been righteous, for some sign that the Emperor understood and approved. The response was always silence, and in that silence she found a truth more profound than any doctrine. Faith without pragmatism was suicide, but pragmatism without faith was damnation. Walking the line between those extremes required a strength that no amount of training could provide. Her sisters noticed the change in her. The absolute certainty that had once characterized her every decision was tempered now by something that looked disturbingly like doubt. She still led prayers with the same fervor, still executed her duties with flawless precision, but there was a hesitation in her pronouncements that had not existed before. When younger sisters asked her about Xeno's protocol, she found herself pausing before reciting the standard responses, remembering an autarch who fought with honor and warlocks who wielded unthinkable power for a cause that temporarily aligned with the Imperium's interests. She wondered if that made her weak, if doubt was the first step toward corruption, or if it simply meant she was growing wiser in a galaxy that rewarded flexibility more than it did rigid adherence to rules written for a universe that no longer existed. The Aeldari perspective on the Alliance remains unknown in any meaningful detail, lost behind the impenetrable secrecy of the craft worlds. But Imperial intelligence occasionally intercepts fragmentary communications that suggest they remember the cooperation as well. References to Mon Ke who held the line appear in Aeldari battle cant, used as examples in training scenarios where temporarily allying with lesser species might serve the greater goal of craft world survival. Some Farseers, those who can perceive the branching paths of possible futures, claim to see a timeline where such alliances become commonplace, where the Imperium and the craft worlds stand together against the true existential threats posed by chaos and the Tyranids. Others dismiss such visions as desperate fantasies, the longings of a dying civilization grasping at any possibility of survival, no matter how remote or distasteful. The question that haunts Imperial tactical doctrine now, whispered in strategium chambers and debated in classified think tanks, is whether Heleth's choice represents an evolutionary adaptation to new realities, or a dangerous corruption of the principles that have kept humanity alive for 10,000 years. The Imperium has always defined itself against the xenos, against the alien, against everything that is not human and not loyal to the Emperor. To compromise that position, even temporarily, even in the face of overwhelming necessity, is to undermine the ideological foundations upon which the entire edifice of imperial civilization rests. Yet the alternative, rigid adherence to doctrine that results in unnecessary defeat, is equally untenable in a galaxy where enemies multiply faster than the Imperium can forge new weapons to fight them. Some see in Heleth's alliance the seeds of a new paradigm, a recognition that the galaxy has changed and imperial doctrine must evolve to match. They point to the increasing frequency of Necron awakenings, the unstoppable advance of Tyranid hive fleets, the metastasizing corruption of chaos as it exploits every weakness in the Imperium's decaying infrastructure. Against threats of such magnitude, they argue, humanity cannot afford the luxury of fighting every battle alone. If temporary alliances with xenos forces can preserve human worlds and buy time for reinforcements, then pragmatism demands considering such options even if faith condemns them. Others see this reasoning as the first step down a slope that ends in wholesale abandonment of the imperial creed, a gradual erosion that will ultimately leave humanity defenseless against the very xenos it once sought to exterminate. The debate remains, unresolved because it is fundamentally irresolvable within the framework of imperial ideology. The Imperium was founded on absolute truths, on the certainty that the Emperor's wisdom was infinite and his plan for humanity was perfect. To acknowledge that circumstances might require deviating from that plan, that survival might demand compromises that doctrine forbids, is to admit that the plan itself might be flawed. This is unthinkable heresy to some and obvious reality to others, and the tension between these perspectives generates a cognitive dissonance that imperial institutions are poorly equipped to process. So, the official position remains ambiguous. Such alliances are neither sanctioned nor forbidden, neither encouraged nor condemned, existing in a bureaucratic gray area where individual commanders bear full responsibility for their choices and face judgment after the fact based on outcomes rather than intentions. For the Sisters of Battle who served on Manifest Null 7, the experience left scars that no amount of prayer could fully heal. They had seen the galaxy's true face, stripped of propaganda and comfortable certainties. They had learned that their faith, while powerful, was not always sufficient. They had discovered that survival sometimes required accepting help from sources that doctrine said were damned, and that this acceptance did not feel like corruption in the moment but rather like simple necessity. Some struggled with this knowledge, questioning whether they remained pure enough to serve as the Emperor's daughters. Others integrated it into a more nuanced understanding of faith, recognizing that rigid inflexibility was itself a form of weakness. All of them carried the memory of fighting beside xenos warriors, of protecting and being protected by the alien, and finding in that cooperation a strange kind of honor that existed outside the boundaries of imperial doctrine. The galaxy continues its inexorable slide toward darkness, and the choices that once seemed unthinkable become increasingly common. Rumors circulate of other such alliances, a Space Marine chapter fighting alongside Tau forces against a Tyranid splinter fleet, A regiment of Astra Militarum accepting intelligence from an Aeldari ranger to prevent a demonic incursion. Even whispers of the Adeptus Custodes tolerating the presence of unregistered psychers within the Imperial Palace for purposes too classified for speculation. These stories are never confirmed, never officially acknowledged, but they persist in the undercurrents of Imperial communication networks, suggesting a pattern that bureaucracy cannot quite suppress. The Imperium is changing, adapting, evolving in ways that its founders never anticipated, and its current leadership can barely comprehend. The ultimate question, the one that keeps theologians and strategists awake through long nights on countless worlds, is whether this adaptation represents salvation or damnation. Is the Imperium learning to survive in a galaxy that has changed beyond recognition since the Emperor walked among humanity, or is it losing the essential character that made it worth preserving in the first place? The answer depends entirely on perspective, on whether one values survival above purity or purity above survival. And the Imperium has never been particularly good at choosing between competing values. So it stumbles forward, making compromises that its doctrine condemns while maintaining the fiction that no compromise has occurred, and hoping that the Emperor's plan, whatever it might be, includes allowances for the messy realities of survival in the 41st millennium. Canoness Heleth continues her duties on the frontier, leading her sisters against threats both conventional and exotic. She has not encountered the Aeldari again, though she sometimes wonders if that autarch still lives, still fights, still remembers the week they spent killing Necrons side by side. On the anniversary of the Battle of Manifest Null Seven, she conducts a private service in her chambers, lighting candles for the sisters who fell and speaking prayers that do not appear in any official liturgy. These prayers acknowledge the xenos who died preserving human lives, honor debts that doctrine says should not exist, and ask the Emperor's forgiveness for choices that faith condemns but survival demanded. Whether the Emperor hears these prayers, whether he approves or condemns, remains as mysterious as everything else about humanity's distant, deteriorating God. The lesson, if any lesson can be extracted from this blood-soaked cooperation, is that the galaxy respects neither faith nor doctrine. It responds only to force and will, to the determination of those who refuse to surrender, regardless of what compromises survival demands. The Sisters of Battle learned this on Manifest Null 7-7, paid for that knowledge with their blood and their certainty, and came away, changed in ways that no amount of prayer or penance could reverse. They remain the Emperor's faithful daughters, warriors without equal in their devotion and ferocity. But they also remember that sometimes faith is not enough, that the Emperor's plan includes contingencies for cooperation with the damned, and that walking the line between heresy and survival requires a strength that goes beyond simple belief. They are the Adepta Sororitas. They are the ones who make the impossible choices so that others need not face them. And if that damnation, then they will embrace it with the same fervor they bring to every other aspect of their service, because the alternative is extinction, and extinction serves neither the Emperor nor his Imperium. The years following the Manifest Null 7-7 incident did not bring clarity. If anything, the questions multiplied like cancerous cells in a body already dying from 1,000 other maladies. The Imperium, vast and implacable as it was, found itself facing a crisis not of military defeat but of theological contradiction. How does an institution built on absolute certainty accommodate the reality that survival increasingly demanded flexibility? The Ministerum's response was characteristic. They buried the question under layers of bureaucratic obfuscation and let time erode the sharp edges of controversy. Official records listed the Necron incursion as resolved through standard Imperial military doctrine, with no mention of xenos involvement. The sisters who served there received commendations for valor that carefully omitted any specifics about their tactics or temporary allies. But silence has never been an effective weapon against truth, particularly not the kind of truth that gets whispered in barracks and training halls across 1,000 worlds. The story spread despite all efforts to contain it. Each retelling stripped away some detail and added others, until a dozen different versions circulated through the militant orders, each one reflecting the biases and fears of whoever told it. Some versions painted Heleth as a visionary who saw past dogma to embrace pragmatic survival. Others depicted her as a cautionary tale, a warrior who let desperation compromise her faith and now suffered in exile as punishment for her weakness. The truth, as always, was more complex and less satisfying than either extreme, but complexity has never been the Imperium's strength. Heleth's new assignment took her to the Ghoul Stars, that region of space so infamous that even veteran navigators refused contracts there unless the pay exceeded reason. The fortress she commanded was less a proper military installation and more a watchpost, a single reinforced monastery clinging to an asteroid that orbited a dying star. Her garrison consisted of 2 centuries of battle sisters, most of them young and untested, sent here either because they were too inexperienced to waste on important fronts or because they had displayed tendencies toward questioning that made their superiors uncomfortable. She recognized the pattern immediately. This was where the Ecclesiarchy sent problems they could not solve and did not want to acknowledge. She was being stored, not deployed, kept far enough from the Imperium's center that her example would not contaminate others, but not formally punished because that would require admitting she had done something wrong. The first months in the Ghoul Stars taught her things about isolation that no amount of meditation or prayer could have prepared her for. Supply ships arrived irregularly, sometimes months late, carrying rations that were already half spoiled and ammunition that was 2 generations obsolete. Astropathic communication was unreliable at best. The messages that did get through often garbled beyond comprehension by whatever unnatural forces made this region of space so hostile to human presence. Her sisters trained constantly because there was nothing else to do, running combat drills in the asteroid's cramped corridors until every movement became muscle memory, studying tactics for threats they might never face, and maintaining equipment that should have been replaced decades ago. The isolation bred a strange kind of clarity. Without the constant oversight of the Ecclesiarchy, without the pressure to conform to expectations that made no sense in practical terms, Heleth found herself thinking thoughts that would have been dangerous anywhere else. She began keeping a journal, something she had not done since her days as a novitiate. The entries were not confessions or theological meditations. They were tactical analyses of the choices she had made on Manifest Null Seven Seven, clinical examinations of what had worked and what had failed, divorced from the emotional weight of doctrine and faith. She wrote about the Aeldari combat doctrine, their ability to coordinate psychic and conventional forces with a precision the Imperium could never match. She documented the ways their aspect warriors specialized in roles that Imperial forces tried to make generalists handle, and how that specialization created devastating efficiency. She noted, with the detachment of a scholar rather than the passion of a zealot, that the Aeldari had been fighting for millions of years, and perhaps their methods deserved study rather than simple dismissal as xenos corruption. These thoughts were heresy, of course. To suggest that humanity might learn from xenos, that the Emperor's way might not be the only way or even the best way for all circumstances, was to question the fundamental premise upon which the Imperium rested. But here in the Ghoul Stars, far from any authority that could punish such questions, Heleth allowed herself to think them. She locked the journal in a secure case that only she could open, and she continued writing, building a repository of knowledge that violated every principle she had been taught, but which might someday save lives if circumstances ever again demanded the unthinkable. Her sisters noticed the change in her command style. She drilled them relentlessly on tactical flexibility, on adapting to unexpected situations, on recognizing when doctrine should be followed, and when it should be abandoned in favor of whatever worked. She taught them to fight not just with faith but with intelligence, to understand their enemies rather than simply hating them. When a young sister asked why they should study xenos combat tactics when their faith was supposed to be sufficient, Heleth did not reprimand her for questioning. Instead, she asked the sister whether the Emperor would prefer his servants to die uselessly following outdated doctrine, or live to fight another day, using whatever methods preserved their ability to serve. The question hung in the air without a clear answer, and Heleth let it hang, understanding that some lessons could only be learned through contemplation rather than instruction. The threats in the Ghoul Stars came irregularly but with devastating intensity. Pirates raiding Imperial shipping lanes, their ships cobbled together from a dozen different technologies, some of which predated the Imperium itself. Orc warbands that emerged from the asteroid fields, with no clear origin and no logical target selection, attacking simply because violence was its own purpose. Stranger things that had no names in Imperial Gothic, creatures that seemed to be warp-spawn but followed patterns too organized for demonic manifestation. Heleth led her sisters against all of them, winning battles that should have been losses through a combination of faith, skill, and the tactical flexibility she had learned on Manifest Null 7-7. Her casualty rates were lower than any other garrison in the sector. Her mission success rate was higher. The Ecclesiarchy did not acknowledge this, did not promote her, or expand her command, but neither did they replace her. She was effective, and, in the Ghoul Stars, effectiveness was rare enough to be valuable even when it came wrapped in uncomfortable questions. 3 years into her exile, a ship arrived that was not on any scheduled supply roster. It bore the marks of the Inquisition, specifically the Ordo Xenos, and its commander was an inquisitor whose name Heleth recognized from classified briefings she had read in what felt like another lifetime. Inquisitor Kravus had a reputation for pragmatism that bordered on heresy itself. A man who believed the Imperium's survival mattered more than its doctrinal purity, and who was willing to use any tool available to ensure that survival. He came to her fortress alone, dismissed his retinue, and sat across from her in the Spartan chamber she used as both office and personal quarters. The conversation that followed was the most dangerous of Heleth's life, more dangerous than any battlefield because what was at stake was not merely her life, but her soul. Kravus spoke bluntly, without the political maneuvering that characterized most inquisitorial discourse. He told her that the Imperium was dying, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the inexorable certainty of a body bleeding from 1,000 wounds, each one too small to be immediately fatal, but collectively sufficient to ensure eventual death. The threats were multiplying faster than the Imperium could respond. Necron tomb worlds were awakening across the galaxy. Tyrannid hive fleets were probing every border. Chaos was spreading through corruption rather than conquest, turning entire sectors against the Emperor through promises that sounded reasonable until it was too late to resist. The Tau were expanding with a patience that suggested they understood time was on their side. Even the Orcs, typically dismissed as a manageable nuisance, were coalescing under leaders with enough intelligence to make them genuinely dangerous. Against all this, the Imperium fought with weapons and doctrine designed 10,000 years ago for an enemy that no longer existed. It clung to faith, as though belief alone could stop a Tyrannid swarm or make a Necron phase out permanently. It executed its best generals for tactical flexibility and promoted mediocrities who followed doctrine even when doctrine led directly to defeat. Kravus had spent decades documenting this institutional suicide, compiling evidence that the Imperium's greatest enemy was not any external threat but its own inability to adapt. He had presented his findings to those who should have cared, and he had been ignored or worse, accused of defeatism and threatened with censure. Now he was building a network of officers and commanders who understood that survival required heresy, that the Emperor's Imperium could only be preserved by violating the very principles upon which it was supposedly built. He wanted Heleth to join this network. He wanted her tactical experience with xenos cooperation, her insights into how such alliances could be managed without sliding into wholesale corruption. He promised her nothing except danger and the probability of eventual discovery and execution, but he offered her something more valuable than safety. The chance to make her choices on Manifest Null 7/7 means something beyond her own survival. He was building a library of forbidden knowledge, tactical doctrines that incorporated xenos methodologies, contingency plans for cooperation scenarios that official Imperial doctrine refused to acknowledge could exist. If the Imperium was going to survive the next century, it needed commanders who could think beyond dogma, and Heleth had proven she was capable of exactly that kind of thinking. The decision should have been easy. Everything in her training screamed that this was a trap, that Kravus was either testing her loyalty or genuinely was the heretic his proposition suggested. She should have arrested him immediately, called for her sisters to take him into custody, and reported the entire conversation to the nearest ecclesiastical authority. That was what her oaths demanded. That was what her faith required. But she remembered standing in that Necron tomb, watching her sisters die against an enemy they could not defeat, and she remembered making a choice that doctrine condemned, but which had saved 3 million Imperial citizens. She remembered the weight of command, the burden of deciding who lived and who died based on choices that no amount of prayer made easier. She asked Kravus what guarantees he could provide that this network would not itself become corrupted, that the pragmatism he advocated would not gradually erode into wholesale abandonment of Imperial values. He laughed, and the sound was bitter enough to etch steel. He told her there were no guarantees, that they were all walking a knife's edge between salvation and damnation with no clear way to tell which side was which. But the alternative was certain extinction, a slow, grinding death as the Imperium collapsed under the weight of its own inflexibility. He would rather die trying something that might work than survive by following doctrine that guaranteed failure. He asked her what she would rather do. Heleth gave him her journal. Every page of tactical analysis, every observation about xenos combat doctrine, every heretical thought she had committed to paper over 3 years of isolation in the Ghoul Stars. She did it knowing that if this decision was wrong, if Kravus was not what he claimed, then she had just handed evidence of her own heresy to an inquisitor who could have her executed with a single word. But she did it anyway because the alternative was watching her knowledge die with her, losing insights that might save lives in some future crisis that demanded the same impossible choices she had already made. Kravus took the journal with hands that trembled slightly, and she realized he had not been certain she would agree. He had come here expecting to be arrested or killed, and her cooperation was as much a relief to him as his existence was a validation of her own doubts. Before he left, Kravus told her something that would haunt her for the rest of her days. He said that the Emperor, whatever he was now after 10,000 years on the Golden Throne, almost certainly understood what they were doing. That a being of his power and knowledge could not be unaware of the network Kravus was building, the heretical pragmatism spreading through the Imperium's command structure. If he disapproved, he had ample means to stop it. The fact that he did not suggested either approval or indifference, and Kravus was not sure which was more terrifying. Heleth had no answer to that. She had spent her entire life serving the Emperor with absolute faith, and now she was being asked to believe that her heresy might be part of his plan. that perhaps the Emperor wanted his servants to think for themselves, even when that thinking led them into doctrinal violation. The possibility was simultaneously liberating and horrifying, and she could not reconcile it with anything she had been taught. The years continued their inexorable progression. The network grew, slowly and carefully, bringing in officers and commanders who had faced similar crises and made similar choices. An Astra Militarum general who had coordinated with Tau forces to evacuate a hive city before a Tyranid invasion. A Space Marine chaplain who had accepted intelligence from a Harlequin to prevent a demonic incursion. A rogue trader who had negotiated with Necron cryptex to gain passage through a tomb world rather than fight a battle that would have destroyed her entire fleet. Each one brought their own experiences, their own hard-won knowledge about how to survive in a galaxy that rewarded flexibility more than it did faith. They shared information through encrypted channels, using codes that were deliberately designed to look like administrative logistics. Traffic. They wrote tactical manuals that were distributed as prayer books, hiding heretical doctrine inside orthodox liturgy. They trained their subordinates to think independently while maintaining the appearance of absolute compliance with imperial doctrine. It was espionage conducted against their own civilization, treason committed in service of that civilization's survival, and the contradiction was enough to drive some of them mad. Heleth watched as officers she respected suffered breakdowns, unable to reconcile their actions with their faith, and she wondered how long she could continue before the same fate claimed her. The answer came on a world designated Fraxis Tertius, a manufacturing center that produced artillery shells for the Astra Militarum. The planet itself was unremarkable, valuable only for its output and strategic location near a major warp route. When a combined Chaos Space Marine warband and demonic host assaulted the planet, the local defense forces called for reinforcements with the desperation of those who understood they were already dead and were simply trying to delay the inevitable. Heleth responded with her garrison from the Ghoul Stars, because they were the closest available Imperial force, arriving to find the situation even worse than reported. The Chaos forces were not simply raiding or destroying. They were converting, turning the population into cultists through a combination of promised salvation and demonstrated power that proved more persuasive than Imperial propaganda. The tactical situation was hopeless by any conventional analysis. Heleth's 2 centuries of battle sisters against a force that numbered in the tens of thousands, supported by demonic entities that could not be killed by conventional weapons, and Chaos Space Marines, who were functionally immortal in their corrupted armor. She could call for additional reinforcements, but the nearest substantial Imperial force was weeks away, and the planet would fall, long before they arrived. She could commit her sisters to a glorious last stand, dying with honor while accomplishing nothing except adding to the casualty statistics. Or she could do something that would mark her as definitively heretical, something that went beyond temporary tactical cooperation and into wholesale betrayal of everything the Adepta Sororitas claimed to represent. There was an Eldar Corsair fleet operating in the region, pirates who raided Imperial shipping and xenos convoys with equal enthusiasm. They were not craft-world Aeldari, not the disciplined warriors she had fought beside on Manifest Null 7/7, but rather outcasts and criminals who lived for plunder and excitement. They had no reason to help the Imperium and every reason to ignore its suffering. But they also hated chaos with an intensity that made Imperial hatred look like mild distaste, because chaos had devoured their gods and threatened to consume the remnants of their dying civilization. Heleth sent a message through channels that officially did not exist, using contacts from Kravis's network, offering the Corsairs something they valued more than treasure: legitimacy. She would grant them safe passage through this sector, a guarantee from the Adepta Sororitas that they would not be attacked or pursued for a period of 1 standard year. in exchange for their assistance in purging the chaos infestation on Fraxis Tertius. The response came within hours. The Corsair Prince, a being whose name translated roughly as laughing death amid the stars, found the offer amusing enough to accept. He brought 3 ships and 200 warriors, armed with weapons that violated a dozen different provisions of Imperial law regarding xenos technology. They made planetfall in a location carefully coordinated to be far from any Imperial observers, and Heleth met them in a bombed-out warehouse that had once manufactured agricultural equipment. The prince was younger than she expected, though young was a relative term for a species that lived centuries. He regarded her with eyes that held genuine curiosity, as though she was some exotic specimen whose behavior defied logical explanation. Their agreement was brutal in its simplicity. The Corsairs would provide shock assault forces, using their superior mobility and firepower to disrupt chaos coordination. The sisters would hold strategic positions and provide the kind of sustained firepower that the lightly armored Aeldari could not match. They would not integrate their forces or pretend to be allies in any meaningful sense. They would simply kill the same enemies in a coordinated fashion, and when the battle was over, they would part ways with the understanding that this cooperation was an aberration, not a precedent. The prince found this arrangement satisfactory, noting that humans were at their most useful when they stopped pretending to be anything other than blunt instruments that pointed in a direction and applied violence until the problem ceased to exist. The battle for Fraxis Tertius lasted 9 days and painted the sky with fires that could be seen from orbit. The Corsairs struck with the kind of hit-and-run tactics that made them so effective as pirates, appearing from unexpected angles to deliver devastating alpha strikes before vanishing into the urban terrain. The sisters held the central cathedral district, turning it into a fortress that the chaos forces hurled themselves against repeatedly, breaking like waves against a cliff face. Heleth coordinated from the cathedral's tallest tower, managing a battle that involved forces she was not supposed to be working with, using tactics that were not taught in any Imperial manual, and making decisions that would have resulted in her immediate execution if any ecclesiastical authority witnessed them. The Chaos forces adapted, as Chaos always did, recognizing the coordination between the Imperial and Aeldari forces and attempting to exploit it. They captured several Corsairs and publicly tortured them in view of Imperial positions, hoping to break the fragile cooperation by forcing the sisters to watch xenos suffer. Heleth felt something cold and hard settle in her chest as she watched through her magnoculars, seeing warriors who fought beside her being flayed alive by Chaos Space Marines who laughed as they worked. She gave the order to her retributors, and heavy bolter fire ended the Corsairs' suffering before the torture could continue. It was a mercy killing, and mercy toward xenos was itself heretical, but she did it anyway because soldiers who fought together deserved better than to be used as psychological weapons. The prince noticed. When his forces swept through that district hours later, he personally recovered the bodies of his fallen warriors, taking the time to extract their soul stones despite the tactical risk. He sent Heleth a message afterward, short and without any of the elaborate courtesy that Craftworld Aeldari typically employed: debt acknowledged. 3 words that carried more weight than any oath or contract, because they represented genuine respect from a species that viewed humanity as barely evolved primitives. She did not respond. She did not need to. They both understood that something had shifted, that the purely transactional nature of their cooperation had evolved into something that neither side had anticipated or necessarily wanted, but which existed nonetheless. The final assault on the Chaos stronghold required both forces to operate in closer coordination than either was comfortable with. The Chaos sorcerer leading the invasion had barricaded himself in the planet's primary manufactorum, using the facility's massive promethium reserves as both shield and weapon. Any conventional assault would have resulted in an explosion that would level half the continent. The Corsairs' warlocks worked with Heleth's most trusted sisters to devise a solution that involved precise timing, psychic manipulation of the warp currents that fed the sorcerer's power, and a suicidal assault by battle sisters who would keep the Chaos forces occupied while the Aeldari psykers did their work. Heleth led that assault personally, because she would not ask her sisters to die for a plan that involved trusting xenos psykers if she was not willing to make the same sacrifice. They advanced through corridors choked with toxic fumes and demonic manifestation, their armor's seals straining against corrupted atmospheres that should have been instantly lethal. Behind them, she could feel the psychic working of the warlocks, a pressure against reality that made her bones ache and her vision blur. The Chaos Sorcerer recognized what was happening too late, his connection to the warp severed by Aeldari expertise before he could mount effective countermeasures, and in that moment of vulnerability, Heleth's power sword took his head from his shoulders. The demonic host collapsed without the sorcerer's will to maintain it, the lesser entities dissipating back into the warp while the greater ones fled to find easier prey. The Chaos Space Marines fought to the last, as they always did, dying without surrender because surrender was no longer a concept they understood. The Corsairs swept through the Manufactorum's upper levels with brutal efficiency, killing survivors and looting everything that was not bolted down with the casual professionalism of those who had made piracy into an art form. Heleth let them take what they wanted, understanding that payment was necessary and that the Manufactorum's treasures were meaningless compared to the planet's survival. The aftermath was worse than the battle. Imperial authorities arrived within days, responding to astropathic distress calls that had been sent before Heleth's arrival. They found a planet saved from chaos corruption, its Manufactorum still functional, and its population mostly intact. They also found evidence of xenos involvement that was too obvious to hide. Aeldari weapon signatures in the forensic analysis, Corsair ship exhaust traces in orbital scans, and most damningly, testimony from Imperial Guard survivors who had watched battle sisters coordinating with xenos warriors. The Inquisition became involved immediately, not Cravus's Ordo Xenos, but the Ordo Hereticus, whose mandate was to root out corruption within imperial institutions themselves. Heleth was arrested and transported to a facility whose location was classified even from her. The interrogation lasted 6 weeks and employed every technique short of direct torture, because even the Inquisition hesitated to torture a canoness of the Adepta Sororitas without ironclad justification. They wanted her to confess, to admit that her cooperation with xenos represented corruption and heresy, to name others in the network that they suspected existed. She told them everything they wanted to know about the battles, providing detailed tactical reports with the clinical precision of a soldier who had nothing to hide. She described the Corsair Prince's forces, their capabilities, their methods, and the exact nature of the agreement she had made. She did not apologize. She did not express regret. She simply explained that she had been presented with a choice between watching 3 million Imperial citizens fall to chaos, or accepting help from sources that doctrine condemned, and she had made the same choice she would make again under identical circumstances. The Inquisitors were not satisfied with this response. They wanted contrition, wanted acknowledgement that she had erred, wanted some leverage they could use to unravel what they suspected was a larger conspiracy. But Heleth had spent years in the Ghoul Stars learning to live with her choices, and she had nothing left to lose that mattered more than the principle she was defending. She told them that the Emperor judged souls, not bureaucrats, and that she would face his judgment when her time came with a clear conscience. The interrogation ended not because she broke, but because they recognized she never would, and continuing served no purpose except wasting resources that were needed elsewhere. The trial was conducted in secrecy, without any of the public spectacle that typically accompanied heresy proceedings. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of her cooperation with xenos forces, multiple incidents spanning years, painting a picture of systematic doctrinal violation. The defense, such as it was, consisted of tactical experts testifying that her choices had been sound given the circumstances, that conventional doctrine would have resulted in catastrophic losses, and that mission success rates mattered more than ideological purity. The inquisitorial judges deliberated for 3 days, a remarkably short time for a case with such far-reaching implications, and delivered a verdict that satisfied nobody, enraged almost everyone. Canoness Heleth Argentius was found guilty of doctrinal violations, but not of heresy. The distinction was subtle but crucial. She had broken rules, yes, but she had done so in service of the Imperium's survival rather than out of corruption or weakness. Her punishment was reduction in rank to simple battle sister, permanent assignment to penal legions where her tactical skills could still serve the Emperor, but where her example would not contaminate others, and formal censure that would remain in her permanent record. It was a compromise verdict, an attempt to acknowledge that she had done wrong while avoiding the uncomfortable question of whether that wrong was actually wrong given the circumstances. Heleth accepted the verdict without comment. She had expected execution and instead received extended service, which was more than she had dared hope for. She was stripped of her armor, her ceremonial weapons, her rank insignia, all the external markers that had defined her identity for decades. They gave her standard issue equipment, assigned her to a penal legion that was scheduled for deployment against an Orc in the Galactic East, and sent her away with nothing except the knowledge that she had done what she believed was right and the uncertainty about whether that belief was itself corrupted. The penal legion was exactly as terrible as its reputation suggested. It consisted of Imperial Guard regiments whose commanders had failed in various ways, soldiers who had shown cowardice or incompetence, and a handful of others like Heleth, whose crimes were political rather than military. They were the Imperium's expendables, the ones thrown at problems too difficult or costly for valuable forces to handle. Life expectancy measured in weeks, casualty rates that made even veteran commanders wince, equipment that was outdated or malfunctioning, support that arrived late if it arrived at all. It was punishment duty, a slow execution, dressed up as continued service. Heleth thrived in it. Without rank to maintain or reputation to protect, she could fight with the kind of feral intensity that her position as Canoness had never permitted. She led from the absolute front, taking point on the most dangerous assaults, volunteering for missions that were essentially suicide runs. Her faith, stripped of ecclesiastical complexity, became something purer and more direct. The Emperor existed, she served him, and everything else was commentary that death would eventually clarify. The soldiers around her, criminals and failures all, began following her not because she outranked them but because she fought harder than any of them and somehow kept surviving when survival should have been impossible. Word spread through the penal legions of a battle sister who fought like a demon, who led assaults that should have failed and somehow turned them into victories. Officers began requesting her specifically for their most desperate operations. She became a legend in the parts of the Imperium that official histories did not record. The places where survival mattered more than doctrine and effectiveness was the only virtue that counted. And in her spare moments, in the rare hours between deployments, she continued writing in a new journal that she kept hidden in her armor's concealed compartments. She documented everything she learned, every tactic that worked, regardless of its doctrinal status, every cooperation with forces that should have been enemies. She was building a library of forbidden knowledge, adding to what Cravus had started, preparing for a future where the Imperium would need this information or die without it. 5 years into her penal service, On a world whose name she never learned and probably never had one worth remembering, Heleth encountered Aeldari warriors again. Not corsairs this time, but actual craft-world forces. A small war host engaged in some mission that Imperial intelligence never properly understood. The tactical situation threw them together against a Tyranid splinter fleet that threatened to consume the planet's biosphere before either faction could accomplish their objectives. The Aeldari Autarch, a different one than she had worked with on Manifest Null 7, but one who moved with the same lethal grace, recognized what she was immediately. Battle sister. Reduced to penal service. Fighting in armor that was barely functional. The Autarch's response was a question asked in flawless Gothic. Did they punish you for working with us? Heleth's answer was simple. Yes. The Autarch nodded, understanding flowing between two warriors who had both paid prices for necessary pragmatism. They coordinated without discussion, falling into tactical patterns that both sides understood even if they came from completely different military traditions. They held a choke point against the Tyranid swarm for 6 hours, sisters and Aeldari fighting shoulder to shoulder as alien monstrosities tried to overwhelm their position through sheer numerical superiority. When it was over, when the last termagant had been reduced to ichor-leaking corpse, the Autarch told Heleth something that she would remember for the rest of her life. Your Imperium is dying because it cannot adapt. But you adapted. That makes you dangerous to them and valuable to survival. Do not let them waste what you have become. Then the Aeldari were gone, departing in their grav transports with the same supernatural speed that characterized all their movements, leaving Heleth standing in a field of alien corpses with her penal legion survivors. She never reported the encounter. Nobody asked, and she did not volunteer the information. But the Autarch's words echoed in her mind during the long months that followed, during deployments to a dozen different war zones, through battles that blurred together into a continuous experience of violence and survival. She was dangerous. Not to the Imperium, never to the Imperium, but to the Imperium's comfortable certainties. And perhaps that was what the Emperor needed. Servants who were dangerous enough to adapt, loyal enough to remain faithful despite that adaptation. The network continued growing without her, spreading through the Imperial military like mycelium through rotting wood. Officers who had faced similar choices found each other through carefully orchestrated coincidences, shared their experiences in coded language, and built a body of practical knowledge that existed in direct contradiction to official doctrine. They did not consider themselves heretics. They considered themselves survivors, pragmatists, who understood that the galaxy had changed, and that clinging to 10,000-year-old doctrine was itself a form of suicide. Whether they were right or wrong was a question that only time and the Emperor's final judgment could answer. The galaxy ground on toward whatever apocalypse awaited it. The Great Rift tore reality in half. Primarchs returned. The Emperor himself stirred on his golden throne, his consciousness expanding across the Imperium in ways that mystics and madmen tried to interpret. Whether any of this represented hope or simply the final death throes of a civilization that had lasted longer than it had any right to, nobody could say with certainty. What Heleth knew, what she had learned through blood and compromise and choices that faith could not adequately guide, was that survival required adaptation. That the Emperor's plan, whatever it might be, almost certainly included room for servants who could think beyond doctrine. That faith without flexibility was suicide, and flexibility without faith was damnation, and walking the line between those extremes was the truest service she could offer. She continued fighting in the penal legions, continued surviving when she should have died, continued learning and documenting and preparing for a future that might never arrive. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before battle when adrenaline had not yet flooded her system and death was still a theoretical rather than immediate possibility, She would think about that autarch on Manifest Null 7-7, the one who had told her that faith was a weapon but should not become a chain. She had spent years trying to understand what that meant, and she had finally reached a conclusion that would have horrified her younger self. Faith was meant to serve survival, not the other way around. The Emperor wanted his servants to live, to adapt, to do whatever was necessary to preserve humanity's presence in the galaxy. If that meant temporarily allying with xenos, compromising with the unclean, making choices that doctrine condemned, then so be it. The Emperor would judge. He always did. But he would judge based on intentions and results, not on rigid adherence to rules that were written for a galaxy that no longer existed. This was Heleth's heresy, and she embraced it, with the same absolute conviction she had once brought to Orthodox faith. She was the Emperor's servant now and always, and if that service required her damnation, then she would accept damnation as simply another form of duty. Because in the end, in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, survival was the only victory that mattered. Everything else was just philosophy that died with those too inflexible to adapt. If damnation is the price of victory, then damnation is holy.